Okay, thank you very much for coming to see my paper today. Today I'm going to be talking about a specific aspect of my research, which is the use of out-of-the-box plagiarism detection software in historical studies. So the historical problem that I'm dealing with is something quite specific. In the 18th and 19th century, you have a limited number of journalists available to most newspapers. Most journalism is done through something called scissors and paste journalism, which in effect is newspapers subscribing to other newspapers, reading them, snipping out the bits they like, and then reprinting them word for word, sometimes character for character, in their own newspaper. Now, this system has a lot of advantages. It basically allows you to have global coverage of the world news without having to pay for foreign correspondence. So you're able to get Parisian news, Australian news, US news in Britain without having to pay a staff. And indeed, during the early 19th century, 1800 to 1820s, a lot of these newspapers are actually run by single individuals, maybe an individual with a few journeymen or apprentices, usually their own sons or nephews. So this is a really big boon to the newspaper industry, and it's one of the reasons why you can have a massive expansion of newspaper printing in the early 19th century. This causes no end of problems to historians. Public historians, academic historians, and amateur historians, because anything you read in a newspaper, you can't be quite sure who actually wrote it. Now, some of the newspapers have good scholarly standards, and they will actually put an attribution. We got this from the Examiner of last Tuesday. This is a very, very small minority of newspapers, and the newspapers don't even do it consistently. They might do it for some articles, but not others, even if they got them from the same place. Other times, one newspaper will give an attribution, but someone will copy that newspaper and keep the attribution in without actually saying where they got it from, something we would refer to our students as stealing footnotes. So there's no real way of knowing where they come from just by looking at the newspapers themselves. And since so many of these newspapers are actually mom and pop operations, they didn't really leave a whole lot of business records behind. So we can't always tell where they were getting their news from. And indeed, one of the newspapers I work with, the Glasgow Advertiser, which is now the Glasgow Herald, one of the largest newspapers in Britain, the original owner really stubbornly refused to hand over his business records when he got bought out. So he lost about 30 years worth of business records for the Herald. So we don't know where he was getting his material from, even though that's the period where most of the scissors and paste journalism took place. So how do we go about finding these actual authors and how the news actually traveled? Well, the old-fashioned way, if you can be called that, is to search and transcribe. You find an article that you think is interesting, you want to make sure it's actually from that newspaper, so you go to lots of different newspaper databases, type in little fragments of it, things that you think are unique to that article, and see what comes up. Does it appear somewhere else in the British or world press before it appeared in your newspaper? And for example, there was a very affecting case of self-murder, or so the headline went, of a young girl committing suicide by laudanum. And if you type that in with the correct dates, you get newspaper articles from all over the world, none of which are actually the one I was looking for. There just seemed to be a lot of suicides in this manner in this particular year. So it's an okay system, but it doesn't work wonderfully. And it's not just because not everything is digitized, although that's a really big problem. The real problem is when computers are searching these databases, as I'm sure you know, they're not searching this image. They're searching the OCR, or the optical character recognition text of that image. So there's a separate database that we're not usually allowed to see as researchers, where they have used machines, used computers to digitize the text, and that's what's being searched. And if you look at these images, we as human beings can read that as captain, but the computer, not so much, depending on how good the OCR was. it might think that that in is actually a U because the top and the bottom are missing. It can't quite tell. And this is particularly the case in the 18th century in English newspapers when you have the long S. OCR can't really handle that. Or if you look at German newspapers with Gothic typeface, the computers absolutely cannot handle that on a consistent basis. I believe one estimation of top of the line OCR was somewhere between 60 to 70% accuracy. And a lot of this was digitized 5, 10, maybe even 15 years ago. It's not top of the line OCR. So this is not really a viable process for finding more than one reprint. If you have one reprint, maybe you can find it. But if you have many, you can't. So you have to think of new and interesting ways to get at this data. Now, what you were able to do in some cases, thankfully the British Library was kind enough to give me their hidden backdoor data to the transcripts of these newspapers. Now, if you see, this is the format I received them in. This is all metadata, the date, the time, the location, and this is the actual text of the article. And you can see each individual word is encoded separately with coordinates to where it is on that image. This is not easy to search. And as you can tell, very few of these are English language words. The OCR was not brilliant at doing this. So what you're able to do with this data, however, is transform it into plain text documents of just the text. So I was able to run it through an XML processor, which basically got rid of all the metadata and all of these coordinates and just put the words and sentences back together. And once I had those text files, I could use plagiarism detection software in order to figure out who was copying from who. So this is my methodology. It's always important when doing computerized research, you write your methodology down, because how else do you document a mouse click, as one of my colleagues once said. So I have my newspapers, I transform them into cleaned up text files, get rid of all the errors. Unfortunately, there are a lot of errors, so I lost some pages. And then you use a program called CopyFind in order to look for reprints. Now, there are lots of different plagiarism detection sources. The one most people are familiar with is something called Turnitin. I'm sure everyone in the room here and most of the people online are familiar with Turnitin. The problem with Turnitin is that it puts everything that you search, generally speaking, into the main database and searches against other essays. That wasn't something I really needed to do, and I'm sure Turnitin didn't want hundreds of thousands of my newspapers clogging up their databases, as amusing as that would have been. So I went for a standalone program. Now this program is called CopyFind. There is a Windows version called WCopyFind, and it was created by a physicist named Lou Bloomfield in Virginia. And it is a really amazing piece of technology. It's a standalone program. You can put in all of your own text files, HTML files, PDFs, anything like that, and it can check them against each other or against a solid state, a solid set that you have devised. So as you gather papers, you can check them against each other. It's free and open source, which means that you can edit the program itself to give you exactly the results you want, which was really useful for me. Most of the addition tracking software used by linguists to see whether this is the 1910 or the 1911 version of a novel, it takes out something called stop words, words like of and the, because they're little words and they don't matter. When it comes to newspaper reprints, they matter, because that's the best way I can tell if one person is copied from a specific person is whether they've left those prepositions or those articles in. So I could customize it to look for exactly what I wanted for. It had left and right matches, which meant basically, are they taking the beginning or the end of the article or the whole of the article? So that let me ask some interesting questions. And it creates these lovely tables for me. Now, just to sort of break this down for you in a little more detail, this is the perfect match. So how much of these two articles were identical, and the overall match. Now the overall match I'll get to in a moment, but the perfect match for now is basically how much of this article matches another one in the database. It gives you the name of the first article and the second, which I was able to name all my text files using some XML magic. And this allows you to see what probably are reprints of each other. Now I left the search parameters really, really vague. I let it capture pretty much anything that if you kind of look like that, it would pretty much look like a reprint. So it might be things that are just on similar topics, use a lot of the same words, aren't necessarily reprints. The reason that I liked CopyFind in particular, and I continue to use it, is this last point. It's really effective at searching through OCR text as opposed to perfect text. So I don't have to go through and transcribe these articles manually. I can use the really messy computer-generated transcriptions, and it still finds most of the matches because of the way that it searches for characters. Now that seems a little vague, so I'll give you a better discussion. These are two articles within the British Library's 19th century newspaper collection. Now, as you can see, this black text doesn't match, so those are two different parts of that page. But the blue and red text is something that it thinks is a match. The red texts are things that it says are identical, so of the ports completed, of the ports completed. And the blue one are ones that are pretty close, but maybe it's got one or two characters wrong. So you can see defense instead of defense, it's added an I, whereas over here it's correct, I believe. So overall, in Turnitin, these would not match. There's too many errors, but CopyFind found it. And I'm able to go through these, if I wanted, one at a time, in order to see how many of them are true matches, and then to make deductions based on that. This article, for example, continues quite a long ways after this one stops. It contains more of the text than that one. So what do I do once I've run this program? Well, first of all, I've perhaps made the parameters too broad because of what I wanted to capture. A single year, there's 100 years digitized by the British Library. A single year contained over 200,000 possible matches. I have a lot of time on my hands, but not that much time on my hands. And I could not possibly go through each one and double check that they are correct. But there are some reasons that it might find a match that I know for a fact aren't real matches. So I wrote a second program in C++ in order to trim some of these out. The first, if they were the same newspaper. So if it was in the Morning Chronicle and then the Morning Chronicle again, it removes that as a possible match. And that's because of advertising. Adverts tended to show 3 or 4 times, and that was what the copy, generally speaking, was. It also restricted the match size by 90 right, 90 left, or 160 overall. So basically, when I told it to look for matches, it was looking for about 30 characters in a row that were the same. And what I'm saying is, okay, you found 30 characters, but do you have at least 90 vaguely in a row that are close to each other? And that was a way of narrowing it down further that I couldn't do with the initial run-through. The last thing I did is I restricted the date separation to 200 days. Now that is a slightly arbitrary number. Basically, I went to 100 days and they were all matches. And I went to 150 days and they were all real matches. And I went to 200 days and they were all real matches. And I went to 250 days and they weren't. And I started working backwards. And about 200 days within Britain is the longest that a reprint would suddenly reappear. After that, it was too old and it wouldn't get reprinted by anyone. So these 3 rules cuts down 200,000 to about 25,000. So it cuts it down significantly. So what do you do with those 25,000 results now that you have them? Well, you can make beautiful social network diagrams of these different newspapers. Now, I know the text is very small, but I'll give you a sort of walkthrough of what these are. Each of these represents one of the 12 newspapers that appeared in the 18 teens in this particular database. And the links between them are representing a newspaper page that appeared in both the Hampshire Telegraph and the Morning Chronicle, for example. The darker and the thicker the line, the more reprints there were in that particular year in both of those newspapers. So it doesn't tell us a lot about where they're going or the path they're traveling. They're just saying that they shared news content. And as you look across the decade, you'll notice some interesting patterns start to appear. At the very beginning, you have this little cluster of newspapers that are very similar in their content. The Derby Mercury, the Oxford Journal, the Ipswich Journal, the Leeds Mercury, the Flying Post in Exeter, and the Hull Packet. They all seem to have very similar newspaper content, even though geographically they're not right next to each other. So they must have similar newspaper networks. And as we go along, this tightly knit clump tends to broaden out. More newspapers are included. There's a homogenizing of the news. And after the Napoleonic War, it starts to clump back up again. And my vague sort of hypothesis at this point is that during the wartime years, there is a lot of news about the war that is being shared very quickly between these newspapers. And they're probably coming from one or two London sources. So for example, the Morning Chronicle, and then being spread out. So I think that probably as the war years ended, people were more interested in either their local news or their local connections to the wider world, and it spread out slightly. This is just a hypothesis, though. But in the end, this doesn't tell us that much. I have no idea whether the news came from the Morning Chronicle or the Derby Mercury, which directions it went, who's the most important node in this network. Well, that's where step 2 comes along. Directionality. Now, directionality is incredibly difficult to do at the best of times. If you don't have a direct attribution, how can you possibly know? Well, the fortunate thing about 19th century newspaper editors is there must be a gene in them. They're all very passive aggressive, in my opinion. And they tend to make very specific types of changes to the articles as they go along. They all have, for example, house style, use of commas rather than semicolons or full stops. They also have tendencies of whether or not they're going to abbreviate the word captain. So Captain Brown or Cat Brown. They'll do these sorts of things consistently. Some newspapers who have ulterior sources will fix the spelling of names, whereas others will keep spelling mistakes. This is really good when you get lots of news from the South Pacific, and they spell quite a lot of the South Pacific islands interestingly, shall we say. And sometimes they'll take entirely different versions of how that name should be spelt, and different people will copy from them. So you can tell this is this variant and this is this variant. But that takes a lot of work. That's very painstaking. You need very specific transcriptions to look at full stops versus commas. Now, I've done this kind of work with a number of case studies. And what I found is that despite my bravado at being able to carefully figure out detective-like which one came from the other, there was actually a simpler way. After I had manually decided the paths they had taken, I ran them back through CopyFind, and I found that actually based solely on the number of characters that were the same, even in the OCR version, it matched my mapping. So by using those numbers I showed you before, the overall match, the left and the right match, you can actually determine who copied from whom. So if you have a particular newspaper, you find the version behind it, the one that came earlier, that is the closest to it, character for character. And with those two pieces of information, the date and the character changes, you can make one of these, a phylogenetic tree, which basically shows the evolution of the article down different pathways. So if we look at one of our original graphs and we put directionality onto it, we get a very different impression of what was going on in the 18 teens. Now this is 1818 to 1819. And as you can see, the Morning Chronicle is the chief node. It is basically sending out information largely to the Caledonian Mercury in Edinburgh, but also the Bristol Mercury, the Flying Post, Oxford, and Hull Packet. And this really puts a huge amount of pressure on the Morning Chronicle as the central node in the newspaper networks. Now, there's a couple of problems that this graph immediately has. First of all, the Morning Chronicle is not the only important newspaper in London in this period. We know for a fact that the Morning Post, the Examiner, the Gazette are all very important to various news networks. So why is the Morning Chronicle so heavily overrepresented? Well, it's because this map shows how many reprints there were. It doesn't show how many things were original reporting, and it certainly doesn't show how many things came from missing nodes, newspapers I don't have access to in this database. So within this particular database, they largely came from the Morning Chronicle, which tells me there are a lot of Whig newspapers in this database. And maybe the best efforts of the British Library to have a good selection geographically has actually led to a kind of monolithic political spectrum, or at least an echo chamber in some respects of where this news came from. So that is my big plea when it comes to this sort of newspaper research. There is a huge amount we can do computationally with very basic plagiarism detection software, but it only works when we have access to the raw data to compute it. So all of these different archives, the Library of Congress chronicling America, the British Library, the National Library of Wales, and especially my heart and soul goes to the National Library of Australia and the Trove newspaper database, which is absolutely beautiful. Please fund it forever. These, through various pathways, do make most of their transcriptions available to users. Private corporations, RedX, ProQuest, the Scotsman Digital Archive are much more closed down. Now, part of recent legislation means that if you have the right to subscribe to a particular database, so if we had a subscription to ProQuest newspapers, we would also have something called the right to mine. We'd be able to get that backing data. And to their credit, ProQuest has actually been very upfront about this. Absolutely, we would love to give you on a hard drive this data. However, it requires a subscription to their database, which not everybody has, or not everyone working on these types of projects has enough access to all of them to create a proper representative network of the 19th century. So plagiarism detection software, very good way of learning about reprints, but only if we can get the infrastructure up behind it so that we do not have skewed networks which tell us misleading things. And if you are at all interested in looking at how some of these things work in more detail, my website, scissorsandpaste.net, has character for character manual transcriptions of several hundred newspaper articles. It's all available for free, open access. You can download it. You can look at it on the website here in its more idyllic and pretty form, or you can download the raw data off of GitHub and do your own experimentation with it. And if you do find anything interesting, please do let me know. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.